Have you ever loved your child with all your heart, only to find out one day that you weren't invited to the most important day of their life? I stood in a brightly lit room in New York, listening to Emily, my son Jack's fiancée, speak. "We want a modern wedding," she said, her voice smooth but cool. "The guest list will be more streamlined. We hope you understand if you don't see your name on it." Jack, my son, sat beside her, his eyes fixed on his wineglass, refusing to meet my gaze. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. Instead, I nodded, as if being excluded from my own son's wedding was the most normal thing in the world. But inside, my mind was already racing, rearranging the files in the old iron box I'd kept hidden for 38 years. I decided in that instant to do something no one in this family ever thought I was capable of. I am Susan Bennett, 68 years old, a retired teacher living alone in a small house in Vermont. Life hasn't been easy. I raised Jack single-handedly after divorcing Michael, my arrogant lawyer ex-husband who always thought he was better than everyone. He left me drowning in debt when Jack was just 4, without a penny of support. I did everything to give Jack a decent life, even enduring nights where I ate plain bread so he could have books for school. I sacrificed my entire life for him, and now, standing here, hearing Emily's words and seeing Jack's reaction, felt like my heart was being squeezed shut. That party was a profound shock. The Manhattan apartment gleamed. Chandeliers sparkled, glasses clinked. I wore a simple blue dress bought on sale, trying desperately to blend in. The people around me, all polished and upper class, laughed and chatted. I was only invited out of family obligation because I was the groom's mother. But then Emily delivered the blow. A modern, intimate wedding, just for their young friends. Jack's words cut even deeper. He finally spoke, his voice filled with a forced excitement, like he was describing a dream. "Mom, we want the wedding at a luxury hotel, with a pool, pop music, something really grand. It suits the younger crowd better. You understand, right?" I looked into my son's eyes, wanting desperately to believe him. I had raised him, wiped his tears when bullies picked on him, stayed up late mending his torn clothes. I thought he wouldn't lie to his mother, but there was a flicker of something artificial in his gaze, as if he were playing a part. I nodded, forcing a smile. "All right, Jack, I understand," but inside a void opened, as if I'd lost something irretrievable. Michael's laughter echoed from a corner, startling me. He stood there, impeccably dressed, schmoozing with friends. I remembered the years after the divorce. Him calling me a failure for staying in Vermont, for choosing teaching over chasing money like him. He always thought I was weak, easily manipulated. But he didn't know, and Jack didn't know, how much stronger I'd become. I grew up in a small Vermont town, where my father, Henry, a carpenter, taught me life doesn't wait for the weak. Yet standing in that room, listening to Jack's lie, felt like a physical blow. My mind drifted to the log cabin by Willow Creek, the one my father built with his own hands. It was where I grew up, where Dad taught me to fish, where I once thought I'd pass it down to Jack, the son who had always been my priority. I had kept the cabin a secret for 38 years, ensuring neither Michael nor Jack knew it belonged solely to me. I hid it like a piece of my father's soul. Now, standing here, I thought of the iron box back home, containing the papers that could change everything. To protect the cabin and cover its expenses, I had worked discreetly with a service organization, allowing the land by the lake to be rented out for weddings, camping, or picnics. The income wasn't much, just enough for taxes and upkeep. I never appeared directly. Everything went through Helen, my best friend and a senior lawyer. Helen helped me set up an anonymous trust, shielding my ownership so no one, especially Michael or Jack, would ever know. It was my secret, held close for far too long. I left the party while toasts were still being made. Stepping onto the street, the New York air felt bitterly cold, filled with the blare of horns. I couldn't stay another minute, couldn't bear another lie. I clutched my purse, thinking of Jack, of his passive acceptance as Emily dismissed me. I remembered his last call, inviting me to a vague family gathering after the wedding. The words now felt like a cruel joke. I didn't cry. Tears wouldn't solve anything. I learned that from my father, from the days he taught me to get back up after every fall. As I got into my car, I whispered to myself, I'll show them who I am. I drove back to Vermont, the city lights fading behind me. The road was long and dark, my thoughts consumed by the iron box hidden beneath my floorboards, holding documents no one had ever seen. I didn't know exactly what I would do, but I knew one thing. I wouldn't let Jack, Emily, or Michael trample on the sacrifices I'd made and the legacy I'd protected. The cabin wasn't just land, it was my father's spirit, my childhood, everything I had left. And I would fight to keep it, no matter the cost. When I finally reached home, it was late. I sank into the old armchair, the one my father made from oak when I was a child. I looked out the window at the star-filled Vermont sky, unnervingly silent. I thought of my father, how he used to say, "Susan, you're stronger than you think." I wasn't sure if I was as strong as he believed, but I knew I couldn't give up. It was time to open the box. I tightened my grip on an imaginary key, feeling a small flame ignite within me. I sat in my small Vermont house, the weak yellow light from the old desk lamp illuminating my hands, still trembling slightly from the drive back from New York. The hurt from the party lingered like a stone in my chest. Alone in the quiet house, surrounded by memories, I looked out the window, replaying Jack's words, his averted gaze. Where was the boy who used to hug me tight and say, "Mom, you're my everything"? I stood up and walked to a corner, pulling out an old framed photograph. It showed Jack and me by Willow Creek when he was 10. We were both beaming, fishing rods in hand, the lake sparkling behind us. The log cabin beside that lake was where I grew up, built by my father, Henry. He was a poor carpenter with little more than pride and love for his family. He saved every spare penny, hiding the money in a wooden box under the floorboards, despite my grandmother's nagging. "Susan," he told me once, his voice rough but kind, "this is where you belong. No matter how hard life gets, you always have this place to come back to." He felled the trees, laid the shingles, carved my name onto the doorframe. Every time I stepped inside, I could almost hear his laughter, see him sitting on the porch, wiping sweat from his brow. The cabin wasn't just shelter, it was my childhood sky. The afternoons Dad taught me to fish, the nights Mom sang lullabies by the fire. When Dad passed away, I swore I'd protect it. That's why I kept it secret, especially from Michael, fearing he'd try to claim it in the divorce. Now, I knelt, pried up the loose floorboard, and pulled out the iron box. It was heavy, rusted, coated in dust, holding the weight of a lifetime. My hands trembled as I thought of my father. I opened the box, the scent of old paper rising to meet me. Inside lay the deed, annual maintenance bills, property tax receipts, proof of a life hidden from view. I sifted through them, remembering the early years after the divorce, working extra shifts, tutoring on weekends, all to keep this place. I'd cut the grass myself, painted the walls, planted flowers, my way of telling Dad I hadn't given up. Then I found his handwritten letter, the script shaky but full of love. "Susan, this is where you belong. Keep it, not for me, but for yourself." I read it again and again, tears welling, but I held them back. There was a time I almost told Jack about the cabin. He was 18, just graduated high school, standing on the porch talking about his dreams of the big city. I wanted to share my secret, to make him understand its value, but I stopped myself, terrified he might let it slip to Michael. Terrified my ex-husband would find a way to take the only piece of my past I had left. I chose silence. Now, sitting here with Dad's letter, I wondered if I'd been wrong not to trust my own son. But Jack had chosen his path, and I had to protect what was mine. I stood, placed the letter gently on the table, and walked out onto the porch. The Vermont air was crisp and quiet, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside me. I thought of Jack's lies, Michael's mocking laughter. I clutched the letter, feeling that small flame inside grow stronger. The next day, needing a distraction, I went out to the backyard, where I grew yellow chrysanthemums. I took a small trowel and started weeding, trying to push away the image of Jack's evasive eyes. The smell of damp earth and fresh grass reminded me of afternoons gardening with a much younger Jack, his hands covered in dirt, grinning triumphantly over a pulled weed. When did he change? Did he now see me as disposable? A car pulled up. It was Betty, the woman who sold vegetables at the town market, holding a bag of apples. "Susan, brought you some from my orchard," she said with her usual kind smile. "How are you? I heard Jack's getting married, but you haven't said a word." I forced a smile, my heart aching. "Yes, he's very busy," I replied, trying to sound normal. Betty tilted her head, her eyes knowing. "You know, the whole town's buzzing about the wedding. They say it's going to be at some grand hotel in New York. Must be quite the affair. You must be so proud of Jack." I nodded, the lump in my throat tightening. I didn't want Betty to know I wasn't invited. Didn't want the town whispers turning into pity. "Thank you, Betty," I said, taking the apples. "I'll enjoy them." She nodded and drove off, leaving me feeling hollow. I carried the apples into the kitchen, placing them on the table, unopened. I sat down, staring at the shiny red fruit, thinking of my father's apple tree by Willow Creek. It stood as a memory of him sitting in its shade, telling me stories. The thought solidified my resolve. I needed to go to the cabin, soon, just to make sure it was still there, still mine. Some wounds don't bleed, but they scar you for life. Especially when they happen on the very ground you've spent 38 years protecting. On Jack's supposed wedding day, I had no special plans. Uninvited, there was no reason to dress up. I just wanted to drive to the log cabin by Willow Creek, sit in Dad's old armchair, listen to the wind sighing through the pines, and remember him teaching me to fish. I thought I could find some peace there, where his memory felt most alive. I put on an old coat, pulled on a wool hat, and got in the car. The road to the lake was as familiar as the lines on my hand. It was my sanctuary, the place I retreated to when life felt overwhelming. Every curve held a memory. Picnics with Jack, afternoons watching him run along the shore. He probably didn't remember any of it now. He was so young then. A faint smile touched my lips at the thought, but it vanished as I neared the property. As I turned onto the dirt track leading to the cabin, I saw flickering lights in the distance. Music drifted on the air, soft, elegant, the kind played at weddings. My heart began to pound. What was going on? I parked the car and walked cautiously through the trees. When I emerged into the clearing, I froze. My land. The land my father sweat blood to buy, the cabin he built with his own hands, was strung with lanterns. Banquet tables were set up beneath the very trees I played under as a child. A wedding was in full swing, and I recognized it instantly. It was Jack and Emily's wedding. Not a luxury hotel, no swimming pool, no exclusive group of young friends. Instead, there were familiar, unwelcome faces. Michael, my ex-husband, in an expensive suit, laughing with Emily's wealthy parents. Their entire circle was there, dressed in finery, raising champagne glasses to the happy couple. I stood hidden in the shadows behind a large bush, feeling as though a knife had been plunged into my chest. Jack had lied. He'd spun a tale about a modern hotel affair, exclusively for the young. But here they were, celebrating on my father's land, oblivious, or perhaps indifferent, to the fact that I was the owner. My fists clenched, nails digging into my palms, trying to contain the fury rising within me. I watched Jack, beaming in his tuxedo beside Emily. He looked happy, but his happiness felt like a slap in the face. Standing there on his grandfather's land without a single thought for his mother. My hands shook so badly I almost dropped my phone. Standing back, hidden, I dialed Jack's number, unsure what I would even say. When he answered, I could hear the music and laughter in the background. "Jack," I said, my voice trembling. "Why did you lie to me? You said a hotel, pop music, only young friends. But I'm standing here at Willow Creek, looking at your wedding." There was a pause. Then Jack's flustered voice came through. "Mom, you misunderstood. Emily wanted somewhere special, and this place, it was perfect." Emily's voice cut in, sharp and cold as ice. "Susan, we just changed the venue." "What's the big deal?" And then, the final insult, Michael's booming laugh in the background. "Susan, you always make such a fuss. Don't ruin the kid's big day." I trembled, not from fear, but from the white-hot rage simmering inside. I ended the call, feeling the world crumble beneath me. I remained in the darkness, watching the celebration continue. Waiters circulated with trays of wine, guests toasted, and Jack danced with Emily under the glow of the lanterns. I wanted to stride out there, to scream that this was my land, my father's land, that they had no right. But I didn't. That wasn't my way. My father taught me that sometimes silence is the most potent preparation for battle. I walked back to the car, gripping the steering wheel, forcing myself to breathe. My heart felt shattered, not just by the lie, but by the violation of my father's sanctuary. I remembered the arrangement with Helen, renting the land through the service organization just to cover taxes and repairs. Seeing it co-opted as a stage for their deceitful celebration, I knew I couldn't stay silent any longer. Driving home, I didn't turn on the radio. Silence filled the car. I thought about their words on the phone. Michael's laugh, Emily's dismissal, and worst of all, Jack's complicity. I remembered Jack, age 10, excitedly telling me that one day he'd build a treehouse here, bigger than Grandpa's. I had smiled then, believing that when he grew up he would love this place as I did. But now he stood on that same land, smiling with strangers, oblivious to everything I'd done for him. Back in my house, I knew what I had to do. I was no longer just the sacrificing mother. I was Susan, Henry's daughter, and I would protect what was mine, whatever the cost. The anger and pain constricted my chest, making it hard to breathe. I couldn't stay in the house. I needed air, needed space to think, to remember who I was. I drove to the small cemetery on the outskirts of town, where my father was buried. The road wound through fields of dry, golden grass. The cemetery was tucked behind a row of maples, small and peaceful. I parked and walked straight to my father's grave. The headstone, etched with his name, Henry Bennett, was worn by weather, but the letters remained clear, like his own quiet resilience. I knelt, placing my hand on the cold stone. "Dad," I whispered, my voice choked. "I don't know what to do anymore." I told him about Jack, about Emily, about their plans for the cabin, about the rage burning inside me. "You taught me to be strong," I said, tears finally escaping. "But I don't know if I have enough strength left." I touched the stone, feeling as if he were listening, still here, like the days he sat by the lake telling me stories about the house he built for me. Nearby, a single wild chrysanthemum pushed through the dry grass, a defiant splash of yellow. I picked it carefully and placed it in the small ceramic vase before the headstone. Dad always liked chrysanthemums. He said they were tough, could grow anywhere. His words echoed in my mind, a faint breeze clearing some of the suffocating weight in my chest. I sat there, hands still on the stone, feeling a new strength seep into my heart. "Dad," I whispered, "I won't let them take what you left. I promise." I stood up, wiping my eyes. The cemetery was silent, but the heaviness had lifted slightly. I looked at the headstone one last time, imagining Dad smiling, his eyes crinkling the way they did when he teased me as a child. I walked back to the car. Dad was still here, in me, in the cabin, in what I was about to do. I started the engine and drove home, my heart lighter but my resolve sharper than steel. Days after the wedding, the images haunted me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Jack dancing with Emily under the lanterns, heard Michael's mocking laughter. The world felt tilted, hostile. I tried to busy myself with routine, watering the potted flowers, dusting old frames, but my mind wouldn't rest. I kept my phone close, half hoping, half dreading a call from Jack, an apology, an explanation, anything. But only silence came, a silence more painful than any words. And then, news from Helen, my steadfast friend, sent a chill down my spine. Helen called while I was making coffee. Her voice, usually warm and practical, sounded heavy. "Susan, sit down," she said. "Emily is persuading Jack to buy the Willow Creek property. She's fallen in love with the place, calls it rustic chic, perfect for a luxury retreat they could invest in. I froze, the hot coffee pot hovering precariously. Buy it? I repeated, my voice hoarse. Who do they think owns it? Helen sighed. Jack contacted the local authorities. He believes the land belongs to some anonymous real estate trust. They have absolutely no idea it's yours. I sank onto a kitchen chair, the floor seeming to drop away. Emily, the girl with the cold smile, hadn't just used my father's land for her wedding, she wanted to turn it into a playground for the rich. And Jack, my son, was going along with it. I thought I'd reached the bottom of hurt, but this felt like a deeper, crueler twist of the knife. Jack, my beloved boy, was willing to let Emily bulldoze his grandfather's legacy, my legacy, just to please her. My hand trembled. Helen, how could he? I whispered. Helen paused. Susan, I don't know, but I know you. You're not going to let them walk all over you. You have the paperwork. You have the rights, and I will help you. I agreed instantly, without hesitation. Helen had been my rock since the divorce, helping with Jack when I worked late, devising the anonymous trust to shield the cabin. She knew my secret, and now she was the only one I could trust in this fight. I stood up and went out onto the porch, taking deep breaths of the cool Vermont air. I gripped the railing, nails digging into the wood, the anger from the wedding day surging back, but this time clearer, sharper. I went back inside, opened a drawer, and pulled out an old letter Jack had written me as a child. Scrawled in crayon, it read, "I love you so much, Mom." I reread it, my heart clenching. Was this how he showed his love now? I folded the letter, put it back in its box, and told myself, I have sacrificed enough. It's time to think of myself. I called Helen back, my voice steadier. Helen, double-check everything in the trust documents. I need to be sure everything is ironclad. Helen chuckled softly, a sound I desperately needed. All right, Susan, I knew you wouldn't back down. I'll prepare everything. What are you planning to do? I paused, looking out the window. I wasn't sure of the exact steps, but I knew I had to confront them first. I had to make them understand this land wasn't just another commodity, not something they could simply acquire and destroy. I'm going to see them, I said. I'm going to tell them the truth. I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. My eyes looked tired, lined with worry. But beneath the fatigue, a spark of defiance flickered. They were about to meet a Susan they never knew existed. The next morning, I drove to Helen's law office in downtown Vermont, clutching the old iron box. The papers inside felt worn from my repeated handling over the years. My heart was heavy, carrying the weight of decades of sacrifice and fresh betrayal. After the shock of the wedding, after learning Jack and Emily intended to buy the Willow Creek land to build a resort, I had no choice left. I had to confront them, not just for the land, but for myself. The mother who had given everything only to be cast aside. Helen sat across from me, her silver hair neatly tied back, her eyes as sharp and perceptive as ever. Her office was simple, a wooden desk, shelves overflowing with files, and an old photo of us at our college graduation, smiling brightly. She carefully reviewed the documents from the box, the deed, maintenance receipts, tax records. Susan, she said, her voice firm, the anonymous trust is completely secure. No one, not Jack, not Emily, not even Michael with all his bluster, can legally challenge your ownership. She looked up, a smile touching her lips, warm yet challenging. There's the Susan I know. The fire never really goes out, does it? Helen had always been my light in the darkness. When Michael left me with debts and a small child, she was there, sometimes slipping cash into my pocket when she knew I couldn't afford milk. It was her idea to create the trust when Michael started sniffing around about assets after the divorce. Susan, she'd said back then, you cannot let that man take what your father left you. Thanks to her, I kept the cabin. Now, she was my anchor in this storm. Hearing her words gave me a flicker of hope, mingled with fear. Confronting Jack and Emily wouldn't be easy. I had spent my life loving him. The thought of deliberately hurting him sent a pang through my chest. I left Helen's office and drove straight to Willow Creek. I needed to feel the place, draw strength from it. I parked and walked into the cabin, the familiar scent of old wood like an embrace from my father. I went to the main door, where Dad had carved my name. Tracing the rough letters with my fingertips, I felt a surge of resolve. This wasn't just about property. It was about identity, about legacy. Back home, I stood before the mirror again, rehearsing the confrontation in my mind. I saw myself. Tired, yes, but unbowed. I called Helen one more time, my voice stronger than it had been in years. "Helen, get everything ready. I'm going to Manhattan to see them." Helen laughed softly. "You just bring that fiery spirit, Susan. The paperwork is already locked and loaded." I managed a small smile. This battle wouldn't be easy. Emily might think she was clever. Michael might think I was weak. But they were about to face a Susan they had never imagined. I packed the essential documents carefully into my handbag. Pulling on my coat, I got into the car. The drive to Manhattan was long, but I didn't feel tired. My heart beat steadily, the rhythm of a warrior preparing for the fight. This would be the biggest battle of my life, but I knew, deep down, I would not lose. Gripping the steering wheel, I drove forward. I was Susan Bennett, and I was going to protect what was mine. I stood before the sleek, imposing door of Jack and Emily's luxury Manhattan apartment, clutching the old iron box. My palms were damp. The polished black door reflected the hallway lights, making me feel small, out of place. But I took a deep breath and knocked, each rap echoing firmly in the quiet corridor. I knew that after tonight, nothing would ever be the same. I had spent the week preparing, reviewing papers with Helen, practicing my words in the mirror. Now it was time to face them, to tell them the truth. Willow Creek was mine, and I would not let them destroy it. The door opened. Emily stood there, draped in a thin silk robe, her smile as cool and practiced as ever. "Susan," she said, a hint of surprise in her voice. "What brings you here so late?" I didn't answer, just stepped past her into the apartment, the iron box held firmly. Jack hovered near the kitchen counter, wine glass in hand, his expression shifting to unease when he saw me. The apartment was flooded with light, expensive abstract art adorning the walls. Emily's taste, undoubtedly. I felt like an intruder, but the feeling only hardened my resolve. I hadn't come begging. I'd come to reclaim what was mine. I placed the iron box on the glass dining table. The metallic clank sounded unnaturally loud in the pristine room. "Jack? Emily?" I said, my voice slow and deliberate. "We need to talk." Emily raised an eyebrow and sank into a chair, crossing her legs elegantly, as if settling in to watch a performance. Jack approached, setting his glass down, his eyes still avoiding mine. "Mom, what's wrong?" he asked, his voice low, betraying his anxiety. I opened the box and began laying out the documents. The deed, the maintenance bills, the tax receipts. The tangible proof of 38 years of secrecy and struggle. I placed them on the table, one by one, like building an unbreachable wall. "This," I said, finally looking directly at Jack, "is the proof of ownership." Jack stammered, his face paling. "Mom, I didn't know." But his eyes told a different story. Shame, deceit. It was clear he had chosen Emily's side long ago. Emily shot to her feet, her voice trembling slightly but still laced with arrogance. "You can't do this. We have plans. We've spoken to the authorities. That land needs to be modernized." I ignored her outburst. I reached back into the box and pulled out my father's letter, the faded ink carrying his strength. I read it aloud, emphasizing each word. "Susan, this is where you belong. Keep it, not for me, but for yourself." The air in the apartment grew heavy, thick with unspoken tension. Emily glared at me, her hands clenched, but she said nothing more. Jack bowed his head, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the table, seemingly lost for words. I looked at him, my heart aching with the memory of the little boy who promised always to be there for me. "Jack," I said, my voice low but sharp as a blade, "I sacrificed my entire life for you. I kept that cabin, not so you could turn it into a resort, not so Emily could show it off to her friends. I kept it for Grandpa, for me, for what we used to have. But you chose your path." I turned my gaze to Emily, saw the color drain from her face, her lips pressed into a thin line. "You don't know me, Emily. You thought I was old, weak, that I'd just roll over. You were wrong. I gathered the papers, placing them back in the iron box. The metallic sounds echoed like a final declaration. I didn't need to hear excuses. I had said what needed to be said. I turned and walked towards the door, not looking back. "Mom, wait," Jack called out, his voice hoarse. But I didn't stop. I felt a strange mix of heartbreak and liberation, as if I had finally severed a painful tie to the past. I stepped out into the dimly lit hallway, the sound of the apartment door closing softly behind me. I clutched the iron box, feeling, somehow, that my father was walking beside me, smiling. Downstairs, I emerged onto the bustling Manhattan street. The air was cold, but I didn't feel alone. I knew Michael wouldn't let this rest, that Emily would fight back, and Jack... I didn't know what Jack would do, but I was no longer afraid. I got into my car and started the long drive back to Vermont, the city lights shrinking in my rearview mirror. My heart was still pounding, but it was the steady beat of a warrior who had finally stood her ground. But it wasn't over. What happens when the child you raised helps destroy the only thing you managed to save from your parents? Do you fight back as I did? Leave a 0 in the comments if you agree. I had just returned from Manhattan, the heat of the confrontation with Jack and Emily still burning within me. Laying those documents on the table, stating plainly that Willow Creek was mine, that I wouldn't let them desecrate my father's legacy. I thought I had made things unequivocally clear. I thought they would have to stop. A few days later, I was cleaning the kitchen, trying to lose myself in mundane tasks, trying to quiet the turmoil inside. I never imagined things would escalate like this. The phone rang, Helen's name flashing on the screen. I answered, but her voice lacked its usual warmth. "Susan, Michael called me yesterday," she said, her tone grave. "He knows you confronted Jack and Emily. He made threats. Said if you don't back off, you'll regret it." I stood frozen, phone pressed hard against my ear, feeling the blood drain from my face. "Regret it?" I echoed, my voice barely a whisper. "What did he say?" Helen sighed heavily. "He said, you're ruining Jack's future and he'll do whatever it takes to protect the children." I collapsed onto a chair, my head spinning. Michael. Always using threats, always trying to intimidate, just like when he called me a failure after the divorce. But this time, a cold dread washed over me. I knew he wasn't just bluffing. He was a lawyer with money and connections, desperate to impress Jack and Emily, to maintain control. "Helen, what can he do?" I asked, unsure if I wanted the answer. "I don't know for sure, Susan," Helen replied after a moment. "But you need to be careful. He's not the type to stop at words." Less than 2 days later, the call came from Mr. Henderson, the caretaker I hired to oversee the Willow Creek property during rentals. His voice trembled over the line. "Mrs. Bennett, you need to come down here right away," he urged. "Someone vandalized the property. They chopped down the big apple tree, tore up the flower garden, and they left a note." My heart seized, constricted. "A note?" I asked, my voice faint. "What did it say?" Mr. Henderson cleared his throat. "It just says, 'Don't make trouble.'" I grabbed a shawl and ran to the car, not even bothering with a coat. The drive to Willow Creek felt agonizingly long. My hands clenched the steering wheel, my mind numb, picturing Dad's apple tree, the one he planted when I was born, the one I used to read under. When I arrived, the scene was worse than I imagined. The flower garden, I'd tended for years, the chrysanthemums, the roses, was trampled, soil scattered everywhere, and the apple tree, my father's pride, was reduced to a jagged stump, the raw cut gleaming obscenely. I sank to my knees, my hand trembling as I touched the severed wood, feeling as if my father himself had been violated. Nearby, I found a single, crushed rosebud, the variety Dad grew for Mom. I clutched it, thorns pricking my palm, but I felt no physical pain. Only a searing, consuming rage, unlike anything I'd ever known. I picked up the note Mr. Henderson had left on the outdoor table. Crude, block letters in black ink. "Don't make trouble." I knew instantly it was Michael. This was his style. Intimidation, destruction, trying to force silence. I stood up and called Helen, my voice shaking but firm. Helen. It was Michael. He destroyed the garden and cut down Dad's tree. I need to know more. Helen promised to investigate. A day later, she called back, her voice tight with fury. Susan, I have terrible news. Michael hired someone to do it. She paused, then delivered the final blow. But the worst part? Jack knew. He told Michael where the property was, gave him the go-ahead. I found a text message. The ground seemed to vanish beneath me. Jack, my son. He hadn't just stayed silent, he was complicit. He knew his father was desecrating his grandfather's land and he let it happen. He enabled it. I sat heavily in the old armchair on my porch, staring out at the mist-covered fields. I was shocked, yet somehow not entirely surprised. But knowing Jack had actively sided with Michael, that he was willing to sacrifice his grandfather's legacy, it felt like I had truly lost my son forever. I gripped the crushed rose, the thorns digging deeper, drawing blood, but I didn't let go. The anger inside me was no longer just an emotion. It was a force, a declaration that I would not let them win. I called Helen again, my voice steady now, devoid of tremor. Helen, prepare the lawsuit against Michael. I want him held accountable for destroying my father's property. And I want to see Jack one last time. He needs to know what he has done. Helen was quiet for a moment. Susan, are you sure? Suing Michael won't be easy, and facing Jack, he's your son. I looked at the rose in my hand, the blood drying on my skin. I'm sure, I said. This is my line in the sand. Helen sighed, but I heard pride in her voice. All right, Susan. I'll prepare everything. You're stronger than anyone I know. I stood up and went inside. I knew suing Michael would be a long, draining fight. I knew facing Jack again would tear at my heart, because despite everything, he was still my son. But I had been silent for too long. I had sacrificed too much. The time for quiet endurance was over. I sat in the log cabin by Willow Creek, the flickering oil lamp casting long shadows on the worn wooden walls. My fingers traced the dried petals of the rose I'd salvaged from the ravaged garden. The anger hadn't subsided, but it was no longer a blinding fire. It had cooled into a hard, clear certainty, compelling me toward decisions I'd avoided for too long. I stood, took paper and a pen, and sat at the table under the lamplight. I knew what I had to do: remove Jack from my will, donate the cabin and land to a conservation trust, and pursue the lawsuit against Michael with everything I had. I called Helen, my anchor through every storm. Helen, I said, my voice resolute. I need to see you. I want to transfer the cabin property to the Conservation Trust, and I want to move forward with the lawsuit against Michael. Helen paused. Susan, are you absolutely sure? These are huge steps. I looked at the fragile rose in the small box on the table, its thorns still sharp. I've never been more serious in my life, I replied. Helen chuckled, a sound laced with pride. All right, my friend. I haven't seen this level of determination in you before. I'll get everything ready. The next day I drove to Helen's office. The air was cold, mist clinging to the windshield, but I felt focused. Helen spread the papers across her desk. The deed, maintenance records, tax receipts, Mr. Henderson's report on the vandalism, and even a copy of the damning text message from Jack to Michael. Susan, she said, her eyes meeting mine, it's all airtight. The Conservation Trust is thrilled and honored to accept the donation, and I've consulted with a top litigator specializing in property damage and malicious destruction. Michael won't get away with this. I nodded, feeling a weight begin to lift. Helen looked at me intently. Are you certain about Jack? Removing him from the will? That's permanent. I thought of Jack, the memory of holding him when he cried, warring with the image of that text message. Do what you think you need to. The betrayal cut deeper than any legal document could express. I'm certain, I said, my voice unwavering. I returned to the cabin, armed with a fresh sheet of paper and the old fountain pen my father used to use. Sitting under the oil lamp's glow, I began to write my new will, my final instructions. I thought of my sacrifices, the late nights, the missed opportunities, all to give Jack stability. I thought of his betrayal, The lies about the wedding, the silence during the confrontation, the complicity in the vandalism. I wrote a separate note, sealing it in an envelope addressed to him. Don't look for me when it all falls apart, Jack. You chose your path. Live with it. Each word felt like a final cut, but also like a declaration of independence from a love that had become toxic. I formally removed Jack as a beneficiary, stipulating that the cabin and surrounding land be transferred entirely to the Conservation Trust, ensuring it could never become the luxury resort Emily envisioned. A few days later, I met Margaret, the representative from the Conservation Trust, at a small cafe in town. She was an older woman with kind eyes and silver hair pulled back in a bun. As I told her about my father, the cabin, the apple tree, and the vandalism, she reached across the table and took my hand, her eyes glistening. Susan, she said softly, I remember your father, Henry, from the old lumber mill. He was a good man. This land will be his legacy, and yours. We will protect it, turn it into a place where memories are honored, safe from destruction. She promised they would place a small plaque by the lake, the Henry Bennett Preserve. I smiled, a genuine smile this time, feeling as though my father was somewhere nearby, nodding in approval. A piece of my fractured heart began to mend. Back home, I called Helen one last time to finalize the lawsuit against Michael. She had compiled all the evidence. Mr. Henderson's report, photographs of the damage, Jack's text message. Susan, she warned, this could be a long fight. Michael's a lawyer, he'll fight dirty. Are you ready? I looked out the window at the moonlit lake. I'm ready, I said. He thinks I'm weak. He's about to find out how wrong he is. Helen laughed softly. That's my girl. I'll file the papers with the court next week. I sat at my table, reviewing the documents one last time. I packaged everything, the will, the donation papers, and arranged for Helen to handle the official filings. As I sealed the final envelope, I felt an immense burden lift, as if shedding chains I'd worn for years. I thought about the future, for the first time untethered from the past. I stood up, extinguished the oil lamp, and stepped out onto the porch. Looking up at the vast, starry Vermont sky, I knew I had done the right thing. My father would be proud, and finally, I was proud of myself. I drove to the cabin a few days after finalizing the transfer to the trust. The afternoon air was cool, golden sunlight dappling the surface of Willow Creek. Margaret, from the trust, called to invite me to a community meeting at the town center to discuss the new Henry Bennett Preserve. Susan, you should come, she urged warmly. People want to keep this legacy alive. I hesitated, reluctant to draw attention, but agreed. I needed to ensure my father's cabin would be respected, a final step in fulfilling my promise. The town hall was filled with familiar Vermont faces. Mr. Henderson, Betty from the market, even some younger teachers I knew. Margaret stood before the crowd. We're here to talk about the Henry Bennett Preserve, she announced clearly, a place saved by an anonymous woman who fought to protect her family's heritage. A murmur went through the room. I sat near the back, clutching my coat, my heart pounding. An elderly man, Mr. Harold, raised his hand. What's so special about that old cabin that it needed saving? Before I could stop myself, I stood up. I knew the man who built it, I said, my voice trembling slightly. Henry Bennett, a poor carpenter who felled every log, laid every shingle so his family would have a safe place. That cabin wasn't just wood and nails. It was built with love. As I sat down, a few people wiped their eyes. Betty squeezed my hand. Well said, Susan. The crowd, moved, began discussing fundraising efforts. A young woman suggested an annual lakeside celebration. I smiled, feeling my father's legacy taking root in the community's care. Driving home, I stopped by the roadside and pulled out an old handkerchief embroidered with Dad's initial, H, something Mom had kept. I held it tight, a tangible link to their strength. Back home, I placed a bouquet of yellow chrysanthemums Betty had pressed into my hand on the kitchen table. The meeting reassured me I wasn't alone. The community stood behind my father's legacy, but I knew the whispers wouldn't stay quiet for long. I sat in my small Vermont house, morning light filtering through the curtains, illuminating the kitchen table where I sipped my coffee. The rich aroma filled the air, but my heart held a confusing mix of peace and emptiness. After removing Jack from my will, donating the cabin, and filing the lawsuit against Michael, I expected complete relief. It wasn't quite that simple. Helen called frequently, her voice buzzing with updates on the ripples spreading from my decisions, the whispers in town, the lawsuit disrupting lives, the community's enthusiastic embrace of the preserve. It was a storm I hadn't fully anticipated. I had no regrets. But sitting here alone, I wondered if I had truly won, or just found a quiet space on the edge of my own pain. The consequences were unfolding, leaving me feeling both proud and profoundly solitary. Helen called one Tuesday morning as I was dusting old photo frames. "Susan, you have to hear this," she said, excitement bubbling in her voice. The Conservation Trust officially announced their ownership of the Willow Creek property. They told the story of a woman protecting her family legacy, anonymously of course, but the whole town is buzzing. I paused, duster in hand, my heart quickening. "Buzzing how?" Helen laughed. "They're calling it the Carpenter's Legacy. People at the cafe, the market, everyone's talking about it. They admire this woman, Susan. They admire you." I sank onto the sofa, trying to absorb her words. The trust had kept its promise, honoring my father. I pictured the small plaque by the lake, the Henry Bennett Preserve, and felt a quiet pride swell within me. But it was a lonely pride. No one in Vermont knew I was the woman behind the story. They spoke of the mysterious benefactor with respect, but I remained just Susan, living alone with scars no one could see. I didn't need the recognition, but sometimes I wished someone understood the cost. The whispers reached me directly during my weekend trip to the market. At the vegetable stall, Betty pulled me aside, her eyes bright. "Susan, have you heard about the Willow Creek land? They say a woman saved it from developers. People are calling the son ungrateful and the lawyer ex-husband arrogant." I managed a faint smile, feigning surprise. "Really?" I asked, though my heart pounded. "Yes," Betty exclaimed. "They're even raising money to help maintain it, calling it the Carpenter's Legacy. Makes you proud, doesn't it?" I nodded, feeling a complex mix of satisfaction and sorrow. Satisfaction that the truth, in its way, was known, sorrow that my son was being labeled ungrateful. The lawsuit against Michael also made waves. Helen sent me a clipping from the Vermont Chronicle. The article spoke of an anonymous woman suing lawyer Michael Campbell for property destruction, complete with photos of the ravaged garden and the severed apple tree stump. "Michael's reputation is taking a hit," Helen reported. "He's scrambling, but the press isn't letting up. They've dubbed him the bully lawyer." I smiled grimly. Michael deserved consequences for his arrogance, for the threatening note, for my father's tree. Yet, the fight felt exhausting, each step draining a part of me. Jack and Emily's wedding, once a topic of elite gossip, was now overshadowed by scandal. Helen relayed news from New York. Their friends whispered about the Vermont land fiasco, about their attempt to seize a family inheritance. I pictured Emily, her cool facade cracking under the scrutiny, Jack silent and bowed, bearing the weight of his choices. I wondered what he felt. Shame, anger, regret? I used to crave knowing, used to hope for that call, that apology. But I wasn't waiting anymore. I had done what I had to do. I couldn't mend another person's heart. One afternoon I drove to Willow Creek with a folding chair and a thermos of hot tea. I sat by the shore, watching the calm water, listening to the wind in the remaining trees. The land bore its scars, the stump, the bare patches where flowers once bloomed, but it was still beautiful, still my father's place. I felt a measure of peace, yet also an emptiness, as if the battle had hollowed me out. Would Jack ever understand? Would he ever know I acted not out of spite, but out of love? For the cabin, for my father, and finally for myself? I didn't have the answers, and perhaps I didn't need them. Back home, sorting through old boxes, I found things I'd forgotten. My mother's small comb, coins my father collected, my grandmother's recipe book. Then, a faded yellow envelope caught my eye. My mother's shaky handwriting addressed it. "To Susan, My dearest daughter. My heart leaped. Mom died when I was young. I never knew she'd left this. I sat in the armchair, opening it with trembling hands, much like when I first read Dad's letter. It was short, but each word resonated deeply. Mom wrote, "Susan, my love, life will hurt you sometimes, but don't let it steal your kindness. Family is precious, but learn to forgive, not for them, but for yourself. It sets you free. I love you." I read it over and over, tears tracing paths down my cheeks. I remembered her gentle lullabies, her hands teaching me to plant flowers, her quiet capacity for forgiveness. She was a silent strength, and I realized I'd learn more from her than I knew. The letter made me think of Jack. Should I forgive him, as Mom would have? I wrestled with the thought, caught between her lesson of kindness and the hard-won necessity of protecting myself. I didn't want to become bitter, but I couldn't let blind love drag me back into pain. I wouldn't forgive in the way that I reopened the door to pain. Not because I didn't love the boy he was, but because I no longer trusted the man he had become. I folded the letter carefully. I wouldn't seek revenge, but to seek my own freedom. I was working in my backyard garden, the small trowel turning the cool earth, the scent of fresh grass rising in the crisp Vermont morning air. The chrysanthemums I'd planted last season were beginning to bloom, vibrant yellow against the turning leaves. I paused, wiping sweat from my brow, feeling a rare moment of peace after months of turmoil. The talk about Willow Creek had quieted slightly. The lawsuit against Michael ground on, but I had found a fragile calm. Then came the knock on the door. Dry, hesitant, yet insistent. I froze, my heart thudding. I knew instantly it was Jack. I wasn't surprised he'd come, just that it was so soon. I had prepared myself to close this chapter, but that didn't make it easy. I walked inside, peering through the thin curtain. Jack stood on the porch, wearing an old green jacket, his shoulders slumped. He looked exhausted, as if he hadn't slept in days. He called my name, his voice hoarse, almost a whisper. "Mom, Mom, please open the door." His eyes were red-rimmed, like he'd been crying. For a fleeting second, I saw the little boy who used to run into my arms after a playground squabble. I stood motionless, hand gripping the curtain, my heart constricting. I opened the door, determined to hear him out one last time, but equally determined not to yield, not to allow myself to be hurt again. As I stepped onto the porch, he began, stumbling over the words. "Mom, I'm sorry." The apology hung in the air, heavy with unspoken complexities. But it was too late for sorry to bridge the chasm between us. It was time for the final word, the one that would set us both free, albeit on different paths. "Live with your choices, Jack," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "As I have lived with my sacrifices, don't call my name when everything collapses." "You built that yourself?" He looked stunned, as if struck. He remained standing there, hands shoved in his pockets, his gaze sweeping over the familiar house with a heavy sadness. His eyes were still red, his hands trembling slightly. Then he bent down, picked up a small, smooth pebble from the walkway and slipped it into his pocket, a tiny, tangible piece of a past he could no longer fully claim. He turned and walked away without another word. I watched him go, then stepped back inside, closing the door softly. I sank into the armchair, feeling utterly drained, as if I'd run a marathon. I didn't cry, but my eyes stung. I thought of Jack, of the years I'd poured my life into him, the sleepless nights, the unwavering love. But then I realized, I didn't need his understanding anymore. I had done what was necessary, not for punishment, but for release. In the weeks that followed, I started doing things I'd never made time for. I signed up to teach a children's art class at the community center, reveling in the chaotic joy of spilled paint and unrestrained laughter. The noise filled the quiet spaces within me. I volunteered with the Conservation Trust, helping plan events for the Henry Bennett Preserve. One golden afternoon, I drove to Willow Creek with my folding chair and my father's old book of poetry. I sat by the tranquil water, feeling his presence in the gentle breeze. I opened the book and read a poem about resilience, my vision blurring with tears, not tears of pain but of catharsis. "You did it," a voice whispered inside me. Perhaps my own, perhaps my father's. You fought, you stood tall, and now you are free. Live these remaining years fully, not for anyone else, but for yourself. I felt a profound sense of release I'd never known. I no longer listened for Jack's call, no longer obsessed over Michael's lawsuit. I had done what was right, and that was enough. I stood and walked to the water's edge, picking up a smooth gray stone, warmed by the afternoon sun. I threw it far out into the lake, watching the ripples spread and disappear. A smile touched my lips. It felt as though the cabin, my father, my mother, and my own reclaimed self were merging into one peaceful whole. I turned and walked away, the Vermont autumn wind cool against my face, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth, full of life. I felt free, as if I had finally found myself after decades of sacrifice. The cabin was still there, safe within the preserve, safe within my heart, forever the place I belonged. I was Susan Bennett. I had lived, I had fought, and now, finally, I would live for myself. If you've ever been a mother, ever given the best piece, ever hidden your pain behind a smile, perhaps you understand Susan. Understand that feeling of standing silently at a threshold, not out of weakness, but out of loving too much, and then, one day, when trust is shattered, you no longer plead but quietly let go to save what's left of yourself. Don't assume age brings acceptance. Some battles only begin when we're wise enough to fight not from anger, but because kindness itself is threatened, and perhaps only then do we truly understand who we are. Have you experienced something like Susan? Sacrificed everything for your children, only to realize you were left standing alone? If a part of you resonates with this story, share your thoughts below. Tell us about the things you've held on to, just for yourself.